that are speaking today to be able to present this material. I want to, before I tell you about interpersonal acceptance rejection theory and a little bit about what we know in history, I want to introduce to you Dr. David Rising. David and I have been working together for off and on for about 22 years. I met him first electronically when he was still a graduate student working on his EDD. And then since then, we've collaborated extensively. And he and I are the authors of the electronic book that I hope that everyone knows about, Recovery from Rejection, a manual of client handouts for clinical practice. And Tatiana Melendez Rhodes and I, Tatiana was a PhD student here at the University of Connecticut, and she and I have been collaborating for about the past 10 years on different aspects of IPART theory. They are both clinicians. I am not, so I will be deferring entirely to them when it comes to clinical issues. But before I turn the workshop over to them, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of interpersonal acceptance rejection theory, or IPART theory, as we refer to it. It's by the way, I invite you to think of yourself in everything that I say for the next 10 minutes or so, because if the theory and the evidence is as powerful as we believe it is, then it is as true for you and me as individuals as it is for the rest of the world. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the rest of the world, what I mean by that. But first, I want to make it clear that IPART theory is an evidence-based theory of socialization and lifespan development, as Bridget mentioned, that intends to predict the major consequences, especially the consequences, but also the causes and other correlates of interpersonal acceptance rejection. The theory is derivative from 6 decades. I'm 85, so I have the advantage of some time here. The theory is derivative from the 6 decades of work that we've been doing with several hundred thousand children and adults on every continent now except for the Antarctic. And in doing this work, we have learned 3 fundamental lessons. And this is the part that I want you to invite you to think about yourself. We've discovered that people, every place on our planet, regardless of differences of race, language, gender, culture, and other kinds of attributes, you and I and everyone else, we understand ourselves to be cared about or not cared about by the people that are most important to us in the same 4 ways. There may be more than 4, we don't know, but if there are more than 4, we haven't found them yet. But at least these 4, and that is to say, I invite you now, think about the person or people that are most important to you and reflect on how warm and affectionate is that person toward you, or alternatively, how cold and unaffectionate is that person? How indifferent and neglecting do you find that person to be toward you? How hostile and aggressive do you find that person to be toward you? And then the 4th form of the rejection that we have found is what we refer to as undifferentiated rejection. That is to say, it's your feeling that this person who's so important to you, this attachment figure, doesn't really care about you, doesn't want you, doesn't appreciate you, doesn't love you, i.e., doesn't, what we refer to as doesn't accept you. So we found that after 6 decades of work, we found no exceptions any place in the world where people fail to have difficulty, children or adults, in understanding and thinking about themselves in terms of these 4 different expressions of the warmth dimension of interpersonal acceptance rejection. The second major lesson that we've learned is that, again, regardless of differences of race, language, culture, gender, and so forth, that you and I, excuse me, people everywhere, when we feel like the person who's most important to us, our attachment figure or figures, don't really love us, want us, appreciate us, whatever word you want to use, then you and I tend to respond in exactly the same 7 to 10 ways. We get anxious, we get secure. We have issues of anger, hostility, aggression, passive aggression, problems with the management of hostility and aggression, and things such as that. It impairs our feelings of self-esteem. It impairs our feelings of self-adequacy. We become less emotionally responsive. We tend to become emotionally unstable, develop a negative worldview, and develop, especially for children, developmentally, the development of a whole range of different cognitive distortions. So those expressions of rejection, acceptance and rejection, love and caring versus the rejection, and the response to it is so virtually invariant across cultures and genders and languages and so forth of the world that we have come to think that it must somehow be built into the very fabric of of what we are as human beings as a result of a common biocultural evolution. Now, if that's the case, then we believe that there must be that probably the brain of brains of rejected children or adults are likely to show differences from the brains of people in their responses and so forth, different from the responses of children and adults who had been raised with love or who are in a loving relationship with their intimate partners or other attachment figures. It turns out that, in fact, we had stepped into a growing but very, very important body of literature in neurobiology, neuropsychology, biochemistry, and so forth, relating to the brain and the effects of childhood deprivation, childhood maltreatment, rejection. The long term, it turns out that the evidence, and this is not all now, everything I've said up to this point is our evidence. Now I'm moving into the evidence mostly of other people, with one exception I want to mention in a moment. We find that the experience of rejection, chronic rejection, and other forms of maltreatment affect change the development of the brain. It changes the structure of the brain. It changes the functioning of the brain in clearly measurable ways. So, in fact, the experiences of rejection are built into, wired in some way into what we are as human beings. And it's no surprise then why we find that because of this constellation of personality dispositions that I just mentioned, the 7 to 10 things of anger and self-esteem and so forth, those things with the rejected individual, they tend to spin out into a whole range of psychological and psychiatric problems: suicide ideation, substance abuse, depression or depressed affect. The list goes on. We know that those things, that rejection tends to be associated with them on a worldwide basis, not simply in North America and elsewhere. My timer just went off, so that tells me that it's time for me to be quiet. So I excuse me. I seem to have a frog in my throat this morning. I'm going to pass the baton now on over to the clinicians to talk about what do we do? How can we help people who, from an IPARTheory perspective, who have experienced serious rejection in their families or in their intimate adult relationships. And Dave, I think this must be ready to be take over at this point.
Yes, I just want to describe this one slide from the PowerPoint slides. And so I'll just mention this, and then Tatiana and I are going to be kind of go back and forth as we go through this. So on slide number 2, or 3, I'm sorry, the next one, this diagram, I just want to briefly point this out to you. This actually is in the ebook, Recovery from Rejection, Manual Client Handouts for Clinical Practice, which you can find on Rona Research Publications. You can download that free and use it as you wish. All the handouts are free. But this warmth dimension of interpersonal relationships, I think is a nice graph that is in handout number 1 in that ebook. And it describes acceptance, the different expressions of acceptance on the left side as I face the graph. And then on the right side is the different expressions of rejection, which Ron had described briefly. And I don't know if we'll have time in the question and answer time. It'd be interesting, Ron, if you could sort of describe how you came up with the term undifferentiated rejection. You described a young man you worked with in Washington, D.C. that helped you come up with this term. And it might be interesting for everybody to hear how you first came up with that. So that hopefully we'll have some time during the question and answer time for that. But this is just a dimension for you to use and to help in your practice. Tatiana, you want to take over for the next one?
Sure. So,
Tatiana, would you like to say a few words about yourself before you start, or?
yes,
Okay.
I'm gonna anticipate what happened is that all my computer went into the PowerPoint, but I want to thank everybody for being here with us today. So we are going to talk a little bit about the treatment in the therapeutic context. So the idea of this workshop is to kind of like give you an idea how we can translate IPART theory into clinical context. So this chart that you see here is one example as to how you can think to organize, your ideas and your session and your intervention. So the first part is related to the assessment. So what you see, as you saw before in the previous slide, we have different aspects of acceptance and rejection, but it could be like an warmth and affection. So how that is shown in the relationship, cold and affectionate, or any kind of hostility, aggression, which is more related to rejection or indifference or neglect, and undifferentiated rejection. So we're gonna focus on this part when we are seeing the assessment. So what type of rejection a person has experienced in childhood or adulthood? So in childhood, from their primary caregiver, in adulthood, with the most significant relationship. In this particular case scenario that I'm going to be talking about later on, is about a couple. So then we're going to use self-report questionnaires. So those self-report has been created, by Dr. Ronner, and they have been validated, and there have been so many studies. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, and then to come up with a diagnosis if appropriate, because like, for example, in a couple relationship, people might not necessarily have a diagnosis. They might have more a relational diagnosis, so in which they have some issues as a couple. But we also find that at the individual level, a person might come, for example, with a major depressive disorder or PTSD or any kind of anxiety disorder, that there has been several studies, like, for example, that they have linked those kind of mental health disorders in relation to early experience of the person. Then we're going to look at what are the therapeutic approaches that we will use. So as any other approach, it's extremely important and critical to establish a therapist alliance. Then we're going to come up with a treatment plan. And depending on the model that we might use, this might be more collaborative, than others. So there are some therapists who feel very comfortable determining what are the areas that they're going to be working on with the client. And there are other group of therapists who prefer to do that in contact with the client, in interaction with the client. So then we're going to select a therapeutic modality that it could be any kind that we might be to have some training like CBT, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy or addressing a specific cognitive distortion. Then we're gonna apply attachment theory models. And this is the part in which we are gonna incorporate, all these findings from the assessment part that we found, related to IPARTheory. So restructure the attachment, that it depends again from what kind of model we're gonna use. We might incorporate a systemic intervention, meaning like we might decide to do, like, for example, family therapy, or we might decide to do couple therapy. We might also incorporate a support system, like, for example, if we're working with people from a school, that's part also of our treatment intervention. We're gonna focus on grief and loss and forgiveness. What we find is, like, for example, when you work from attachment, there is an attachment injury. So there is some pain that people are experiencing. There is some loss that people have experienced in their life. So that pain being there, people do not recognize it necessarily, that is affecting their interpersonal relationship with others. So that area needs to be addressed too. And very important, I mean, it's the last piece, but not less important. It's very critical, actually, to kind of like determine what is the culture, what is the cultural background of this person. To look at this from an intersectionality standpoint, meaning like a person is not just what we see in front of us. It has different kind of characteristics, right? Like nation of origin, language, education, sociocultural background, religion, faith, so on and so forth. So in some cases, we might need to, we might determine that it might be important a medical consultation. By that, we mean a recent physical examination, if that has happened, or a physical assessment. Like, for example, we might decide that the person needs to have a more in-depth assessment, by a psychiatrist. We might infer that people might need, for example, medication. And there are other approaches as well, that it depends of what people think it might be important, and also how do you conceptualize psychotherapy. So we definitely pay attention to cultural values and worldview of people. Other therapies would like to incorporate, for example, prayer, because that's part of a healing process as well, faith, spiritual belief in general, or other therapeutic modalities. For example, here in the US, it's very common, for example, to incorporate meditation or mindfulness as part of the session, or recommend the client, for example, to do to engage in yoga or do any other activity, that make a connection between their body and their mind. So for IPARTheory, as I mentioned before, so it's we have evidence-based instrument that at the end of this presentation, you're gonna see where you can get that information from. So you're gonna see here just a number, a very small number of all the instruments that are used in IPARTheory. And in reality, there are 42 measures and in 67 languages around the world. So there has been several studies that have replicated some studies and some new and many new studies in which they have used a variety of instruments. So all these measures have been validated, translated, and validated again. So in this particular case, since Dave and I will be talking about presenting to you some case studies. So the most common one that we have included for the purpose of this presentation are the child version of the parental acceptance rejection questionnaire, And then we have the child version of the parental acceptance rejection control questionnaire, father and mother form. Then we have intimate adult relationship questionnaire, an adult version of the parental acceptance rejection from father and mother forms. So these are some few examples. You can find those also in the handbook for the study of parental and acceptance rejection by Roner and Kaleki in 2005. Dave?
Okay. Yes. One of the things that I think is true of, I'm guessing, the majority of clinicians is that we are selectively eclectic. We'll borrow from different therapy theories and therapy modalities. And so here's some examples of some popular therapy modalities or theories that we think are very compatible with IPAR theory. For example, emotionally focused couples therapy. Dr. Sue Johnson out of Ottawa is, I think, the pioneer in that. She uses attachment theory as her theory of love, forming the framework for her work. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, some overlap between attachment theory and IPAR theory. And I know, Ron, you have done some collaboration with Dr. Bowlby before he died, and you're done some research to show that. And then relationship enhancement therapy by Dr. Bernard Gurney out of Penn State. It's a very skill-based approach to working with couples. And I know I integrate that. I've studied with Dr. Bernard Gurney, and I integrate that when I'm looking at helping couples work on communication and working through rejection issues. Choice theory, formerly called reality therapy theory by Dr. William Glasser. I used that theory when I worked in the largest maximum security prison in Florida back when Ted Bundy was there, and would run skill-based groups helping men practice relationship skills. For many who had experienced rejection, we would do skill-based groups. So it's a very good theory to integrate. And then cognitive behavioral theory, I think very popular theory that looks at negative cognitions that people have, and certainly many go along with rejection issues. And then family therapy, of course, getting their family system involved to help repair relationships. And there's a term, network therapy. I don't know if this is I just borrowed that in my own clinical practice. And that's where I'll pull in people's support system, maybe friends, church members who can help do some what I call reparenting, where there's been rejection, and helping to heal in restorative relationships. So those are some examples of some therapeutic modalities or theories that we can integrate with IPAR theory. Could you go? You're next, I think, Tatiana, if you want to take it over.
So what we're gonna do now is show you how we can incorporate IPAR theory. So what is a potential clinical application? It's not the only modality, but we just want to give you an example. And then what we would like you to do is, like, as you read case examples, I would like you to kind of like think about what you would do, given the cultural context, because we want to make sure that we're telling you what we would do definitely here based on our experience and based on our context. But some of these things might differ based on where we are located. So just think about it. Maybe it could be a point of discussion later on after we finish the presentation. So the first one, I am a marriage and family therapist, so that is my specialty. I teach at a university here in graduate school in the marriage and family therapy program. So what I will be talking about is how to apply IPAR theory in a case example with couples. So I'm gonna read the case study, and we're gonna think about what we would do. John and Lisa came to therapy because of communication problems. Lisa said that John spent much of his time at work. Additionally, they have been disagreeing recently about many things, including how to raise their two small children. Now Lisa feels alone and abandoned by him. Moreover, when she asks John about his day or tries to initiate a connection with him, he becomes monosyllabic and watches TV or checks his cell phone. John, on the other hand, complains that Lisa is not satisfied with anything. Rather than supporting him, she criticizes him all the time and gets angry. So he prefers to be alone to avoid more problems. So this is a very typical case scenario. So we're seeing here, that the first thing that you're gonna hear in sections, we have communication problems. So there are different ways of how we can go, right? So there are some therapists who are more practical in their approach, and they might, what they might do is just say, okay, so if they are having communication problems, so let's address that immediately. So we're gonna give them some handouts, or we're gonna teaching them like listening skills, and we're gonna teaching them how to stop when the other person is talking, so on and so forth. So that might be a way of how to do it. Others might try to decrease the issue. So might say, well, if you feel like you are angry, or if you feel like you don't want to talk about it, so just take your time and be alone for let's say an hour, and they come back and then we talk about it. That's another way of how do that intervention. But what I do is a little bit different. So let me explain here. So based on IPART theory, so we talk about doing the assessment, going through the planning, what is exactly what we will do. In other words, I will identify aspects of the relationship that needs to be modified or improved. What is what we need to understand? We need to kind of like create a conceptualization of the case, right? And then we're going to start with the treatment and intervention piece. But equally important is the follow-up. So because sometimes, as we know, I think that we are working here with many psychologists, we know that usually there is this, especially when you work with couples, there is this period of the honeymoon, right? So you work with a couple like 2-3 sessions, and suddenly they start feeling better, and they kind of like just stop therapy. Or so they say, well, there's no need anymore for us to come here because we are doing much better. But you have to explain the couple and everybody else that, this is going to go up and then potentially down. And they want to make sure that you see that follow up and what happens. So in the assessment piece, for this specific couple, so we have the adult parental acceptance rejection control questionnaire, so which help the partner reflect on the quality of their childhood relationship, with their parents or significant caregivers. And that's very important. Why? Because we know that the interaction of the relationship with children by all means have, an effect on the relationship that people were gonna have with others or with significant others when they are adults. And we wanna also see, if there any kind of correlation or similarity or justification. So then you have the intimate partner acceptance rejecting. So it's gonna help the partner examine the quality of their current relationship with one another. So that this person feels accepted, that this person feels rejected, that this person feels like for example, perceive, that their caregivers supported them, jealous them, supported them, or were not available for them where they needed it. So it's I feel rejected, it's I feel that my parents perhaps didn't spend that much time with me, or I have to figure things out by my own, or I learned while growing up that I needed it to protect myself maybe by, just giving, So I will translate all of that early experience into my current relationship. And so you start getting from some of the items some information that will kind of like, will put people in some of these 5 scales, like warm affection or hostility, aggression, if there was or there is any. If there was some lack of interest or lack of care, and that is very important to get that information. So you have now information from how this person perceives his relationship with the mother, that relationship with the father, and also that relationship with the partner. So you're gonna see, that's a very important data to determine what you're going to do. In this specific case, so we had the presenting problem, communication issues. And we know that IPARTheory, it's a theory that looks at things from a developmental perspective, for interpersonal and acceptance rejection. So it goes from childhood through all adulthood. So for me, it's what's very important to see what's happening in psychic and interpersonal, meaning within and between, right? So in the person and also as part of the relationship with the partner. So as an individual, I'm asking myself, so what are John's and Lisa's perception of rejection and behavior control in childhood? What specific items as assessment tool are are going to be part of the therapeutic process? I can also raise awareness about the issue that might not necessarily be implicit in the relationship. So Lisa and John, after having done this assessment, they have experienced different forms of rejection in the relationship with their parents. Yeah, feel, for example, neglected, fear that there was a lack of interest. In the case of John, Lisa, on the other hand, it was a person who needed actually, to seek the attention, to be more intentional about seeking attention from her caregiver. So in the world of EFT or emotionally focused therapy, she would be more a pursuer, whereas John would be more a withdrawer, right? So she tried to get to him and make a connection, but he tries to leave. And try to leave not because he doesn't love her, but try to leave to protect himself because he learned early on that he had to do that it was not good to have a connection, to talk to the person, because in his mind, he was going to lose anyways. So we are going to have an interview to kind of like get what were the early experiences of these people. So I know not only going to have the assessment, but I will also have an interview to kind of like get the attachment history. In other words, to get a more qualitative report from the couple individually to see what will happen. I can take advantage, for example, of some of the items of IPARTheory. So maybe what do you think about that? Or maybe to use those questions to help the individual to elaborate further or provide a specific example to create awareness of how they see somehow how this is now shown in the relationship. And then I'm going to look at how did their history influencing their current couple's dynamics. So there are implications in adult attachment. What is the quality of Lisa's and John's relationship? And I'm going to do a cultural assessment as well, because as I mentioned early on, it's very critical. So then I'm going to start planning, and part of what I'm going to use with this couple is emotionally focused therapy. So emotional focused therapy, is a model, that is very compatible with IPARTheory because they also focus a lot of their work in attachment theory. So people are wired for connection. And so we start from that piece. So I want to connect, and I might not necessarily know how to, or my early experience, maybe it was disorganized. So I know that I can reach a person, but I might be rejected. Or when I was growing up, there were some times in which my parents really show me affection, but there were times in which they didn't. So it's kind of like confused me. What is good? What is feels good? Should I do? Should I go and reach out or not? So that's gonna make me a person who is not easy to engage or to respond or to be accessible in my relationship, right? So that's kind of like the idea. So I want to make sure that I incorporate that piece of IPAR theory, into my current work with a couple. So with this couple, I'm going to help them to see that what kind of cycle is that they are engaged in, what kind of pattern, that pattern in one way or another is informed, by this attachment relationship that they have. So the idea is to try to create a more safe space, to try to create a connection that they are capable of recognizing, in what way they are relating now, that they become more vulnerable. So EFT work with the emotional piece. We don't try to deny it. We don't try to get it out of the picture. What we're trying to do is to go deeper and deeper. So what the person, in this case, was Liz seeing, or what they are seeing is the anger piece. So they get angry. But we have to go, what is behind the anger? So the anger is the secondary emotion. It's what everybody sees. But what is in? So that would be the primary emotion, the vulnerability piece of that. So maybe I feel that I will lose you. So my fear of losing you somehow translates into anger. But that happened in many sessions. So we have to go from that piece of secondary emotion, which is the anger, to the primary emotion, which might be the fear of abandonment, right? That fear of abandonment might be connected to what? To the rejecting piece, that the person experienced early on in the relationship with the primary caregiver. And that's the beauty, of incorporating IPAR theory, in the therapeutic work. So this is kind of like a summary of what we would do with this case. I'm very interested, in having this conversation in a little while after Dave present his case.
Okay, but there's a lot I would love to interact with you, Tatiana. I think there's so much richness in what you presented, and it's too bad we didn't have more time, but we do our best. But what I wanted to do, just to introduce myself a little bit more, I am currently in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. If you ever heard of the Little League World Series, I'm smack right in that town. If I had a window in my office, I could actually see it right from my office up on the mountain. But we're kind of a more conservative, rural community nestled in the mountains, and so I'm in a holistic healthcare practice. We have 5 family physicians, we have a number of nurses, and other support staff, and then we have 4 psychotherapists. So what attracted me to work here was the holistic health model, that people are multidimensional, physical, psychological, spiritual, relational, volitional, etc. And so when I look at a case, I try to look at it in a holistic manner. And so I'll maybe bring some dynamics of that out in this case. But let me just read this case to you. Samantha, a 38-year-old Caucasian female, initiated counseling to address symptoms of depression, anxiety, chronic anger, and toxic shame related to past unresolved childhood sexual abuse, and strong feelings of perceived rejection from her biological father. Additionally, she struggled to set healthy boundaries with her father, who eventually went to prison for various crimes. Her counselor, using interpersonal acceptance rejection theory, IPAR theory, as a theoretical framework, helped her, 1, process unresolved emotions related to childhood trauma and rejection, forgive her father, and formulate and set healthy boundaries with her father after he was released from prison. When Samantha completed counseling, she reported that she and her father had repaired their relationship to the extent that she was serving as his primary caregiver. She also acknowledged no longer struggling with symptoms of depression, chronic anger, and toxic shame. And this case was a really, really rewarding case to work with. And I've changed some of the details so you don't know who this person is. But I'd like to, and she actually wrote a life story and wanted me to share that with you guys. And so I really appreciate her generosity and using her experience to help others, which I'm going to point out at the end of our analysis. Next slide, could you show up the next one? So just to help you understand how I approach the case, she was referred to me by one of our family doctors, which happens a lot in a holistic practice. With 5 doctors, they'll often refer to us counselors for counseling for their patients. And so she came to me. The doctor was concerned particularly about her anxiety level. And so I, talked with her on the phone and then met with her. And some of the things that I look at as I work with people and as I work with her is compatibility of worldview. And what I mean by worldview can include things like religious beliefs, cultural kind of background, and also her gender, because she was reporting sexual abuse trauma by a friend of her father's from age 8 to about age 14. And she also reported physical and emotional and verbal abuse from her dad. And so I wasn't sure how she would relate to me as a man, but in our case, I think it was really good, because when you are injured in an unhealthy relationship, the healing comes as you are in a restorative relationship. So for me as a male therapist, as I look back on the case, I think it was helpful that she worked with hopefully a male who was safe. Also, her religious worldview was very strong. Our practice is known in the community of working more from a Christian-based Judeo-Christian worldview. Not all of us practice that way, but most of us counselors do. And many clients come here because they want that compatibility of worldview. So we certainly match there. So the therapeutic alliance, I think, was good. In terms of assessment, I don't use, I'm kind of spontaneous, maybe not as structured as some therapists. So I have used the IPARTheory questionnaires with clients, but what I've been doing more lately is taking the first handout from the Recovery from Rejection ebook and then giving it to the client to take home. And I'm talking particularly about adults, so they can read about acceptance rejection theory. And then what I have them do is take it home, highlight everything that applies to them in terms of the 7 personality dispositions that Ron highlighted at the beginning of this talk. And then I have them bring it back the next session, and we talk about what parts of that handout really apply to them. And then from there, we develop a treatment plan with goals and approaching, what issues to work on. I do use another questionnaire that's not from IPARTheory. It's called the QPAS, and I don't know that you can see it very well, but it assesses a lot of other symptoms like depression, anxiety, anger, substance abuse, issues like panic. So I try to combine different assessment questionnaires as I assess people. In terms of the treatment plan, I won't say a lot because we don't have a lot of time here, but certainly I have to come up with a diagnosis, an ICD-10 diagnosis, because insurance companies will not pay without that. Plus it helps, diagnosis helps determine, our treatment approach. And so we talk about goals. I have them take a questionnaire home, and I had her do that. And then, I kind of talk with her about the best approach to her therapy. I ask everybody who comes to me if they've had a physical exam within the last year, because I find that sometimes physical problems mimic psychological problems. In her case, she had a current enough physical. Her doctor referred her to me. So I knew that she had just met with him. To me, that's a very important piece here. I think sometimes we can handicap ourselves as clinicians when we don't look at the physical dimension. Like, for example, if someone has hypothyroidism and they're depressed, if I don't know that, I could think that their depression is coming from something else, and then we are spinning our wheels. So that's some thoughts there about, as I assessed her. Now, in terms of treatment considerations, could you go to the next slide? What I've done here is sort of gone to handout number 1 in the treatment section and pulled out some of the key aspects of treatment that we identified in that first handout for people. And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, I've been trained in that as well. And so for Samantha, I did a lot of helping her look at some negative ways she saw herself, because low self-esteem was certainly one of the big issues she talked about. IPARTheory calls it negative self-esteem. And her father wanted a boy. And so he didn't get one. So he would call her daughter number 1 son to everybody. He would actually say that. Here's my daughter number 1 son. And so she spent so much of her upbringing trying to earn his approval, but never could get there. And then when her father sort of looked the other way when his friend sexually abused her, that certainly cemented in her mind that she was worthless and couldn't measure up. And then she developed some strong rage and anger, primarily towards the guy who abused her. She wanted to kill him. She said she came very close to doing that growing up, but she fortunately didn't. But she eventually channeled her anger into protecting her younger sister from being abused. But she had a lot of negative ways she looked at herself. So we spent a lot of time looking at that and helping her develop more constructive ways to see herself. And to me, that's very important when we're talking about working with issues related to rejection. And then, of course, the next point, encouraging the expression of unresolved feelings and the grieving of losses related to past trauma and the lack of acceptance in childhood. And that she did some even before she came to me, but I think that is so critical. People don't do that. I think of the famous pop star, Michael Jackson, and I've watched some documentaries on his life, and he had some real issues around rejection from his father. And if I were counseling him, which I don't know that I'd want to because of all the press that would come around it, he tried to reenact. He had a penthouse suite that he rented, and he would put mannequins of school teachers and other figures as a way to kind of reenact the childhood that he always wanted, that he never got. And if I were working with him, I would say, Michael, you can't do that. You have to grieve it. It's over. And grieve those losses. And I don't know that he ever did that before he died. You know, I don't know him personally, so maybe he did, but I'm doubtful. So that's very important. And that Samantha did some of that. But I think the next point is probably the most critical in the success of her case is the forgiveness work that she did, because she was very, very angry and full of rage toward men and her father. Her father eventually went to prison because of his rage problem, and she cut him off. I was actually working with her during this time, and I encouraged her to set boundaries and cut that relationship off until she got healthier to know how to set boundaries. And so for a period of time while her dad was in prison, she had minimal interaction with him. And that's when she did some forgiveness work. Her stepfather actually was really key in her life because he was the only really healthy person that she felt loved by. And I want to read just something she said personally. She said, a wonderful man of God came into my family's life. This man married my grandmother. She writes a little bit awkward here, but he accepted me into his home when I was 18. With all my anger and hatred, he protected me when others in the family would attack me or call me a liar. He showed me I was worthy of being loved. If this wonderful man could love, again, her sentence is broken here. She said, this man was a veteran. I'm sure he had been through horrible things he won't talk about. I asked him, he explained to me, forgiveness is not for the other person. The other person knows what they did was wrong. They don't care. However, hatred can take root and destroy you. It's like planting an ivy on a brick house. If left untreated, it'll eat away at the mortar and destroy the house. He took me out to his old chimney and showed me the damage that some ivy was causing. I realized my depression and a lot of my physical and mental pain was caused because I, like my father, allowed the hatred to take root and destroy me. It was hard, but I did choose forgiveness. And I think that if I were to highlight anything along with the boundary setting was so important in her healing was to forgive her father uh, who had hurt her so badly. The next point, identify signs of an emotionally healthy person. When I'm working with trauma victims like her, it's very easy for people to go the other extreme and say, well, everybody's unsafe. And they develop a negative worldview, which is one of the constructs in IPAR theory. And so they sort of act like, in her case, like all men are bad, although her stepfather helped her see something different. But she still had a negative way of looking at people. And so what I do, and this is where bibliotherapy comes in, where I have people read stuff. I have a book called Safe People, one of my favorite books, How to Find Relationships That Are Good for You and Avoid Those That Aren't. And so I try to help people see that what you really need to do, because we all still need to connect, is to develop a finely tuned radar that helps them identify the signs of an emotionally safe person versus the signs of an emotionally unsafe person, and then get better at setting boundaries and recognizing who they can open their heart more to and who they better keep their heart closed towards. So that was a critical thing that I did with her. So let me just kind of wrap this up because I see we're about out of time. Could you go to the next slide? Okay. And then in terms of behavioral changes and skill building related to IPAR theory, related to the negative personality dispositions, again, when I give them that first handout, they identify which personality dispositions need help with. And with her low self-esteem or negative self-esteem, and also negative self-adequacy, I think those two were involved in me really working with her on boundary setting and assertiveness skills. And so we really focused on that and developed a treatment plan around that. Now, I would mention DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. Marshall Linehan has a lot of handouts and skill building exercise for emotional regulation that you can use here, but I didn't use that so much with her, but I use that with other people. Build support system and set boundaries. I use a book called Boundaries. This is a book that there's another edition since this one, but one of the women's shelters here had used that book in working with women who are in domestic violence to help them set healthy boundaries. And I think that is so critical. That is what she really worked on. She set such good boundaries with her father that he knew she meant business. So when he got out of prison and no one else wanted to be around him, she said, Dad, I love you, but you got to treat me with respect. And if you don't, I'm going to stay away from you. And so he began to respect her to the point, and as she forgave him, that she now is his primary caregiver, which to me is amazing. How she forgave, set boundaries, and now is kind of a redemptive person in her own father's life. Integration of spirituality. This I think is really critical. I think sometimes in academia we can be very sterile and academic in the way of approach problems and forget that there's a spiritual side of people. And it reminds me, Ron, of an email you forwarded to me over a year ago from a student at a university who was acquainted with your theory. And she talked about her rejection and said that spirituality was a big piece of her healing. And she recommended that be looked at by you and us. And I think she's right. So that was really critical with Samantha as we pray together, and she really felt that was a source of her healing. I mentioned bibliotherapy or videotherapy. Sometimes I'll refer people to TED Talks. I think, Ron, you have a TED Talk. Actually, I had a client come to me based on your TED Talk and called me and said, I want I see that you do this kind of therapy with IPARTheory. But Brene Brown, who's a big researcher on shame, I refer people to that. Handouts, counseling books use that a lot for homework. And then the last point, reaching out and expressing empathy to others, using your experience of rejection to help others. I tell everybody, because a lot of people say, why did this happen to me? You know, why would God allow all this to happen to me? And I don't have any comprehensive explanation for that. But one of the things I say is that you can use your experience to help others. And that's what Samantha wanted me to do by sharing her story with you. And she wants her story to help other people. And so I think it's kind of like making lemonade out of lemons. That's a saying we have in our culture. I think is a really, really important step as I work with people. So that's the case. Let me just, can we go to the next slide? And here's a slide just gives you more information. If you want to look into IPARTheory in more detail, there's a great website, the Ronald Nancy Rona Center for the Study of Interpersonal Acceptance Rejection. Tons and tons of research articles and references. Highly recommend that. Of course, we've mentioned about the ebook that you can find on Rona Research Publications, and you can download that and use it free. Have your clients download stuff. And of course, Rona Research Publications, and then the handbook that Tatiana highlighted earlier is a great resource. Could you go to the next slide? And then here's our contact information. If you wanted to follow up with any other questions, you're free to do that. So that's that. And I guess the next part is questions. I'll turn it over to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, David, Tatiana, and Ron. It was really a great overview of what IPART is and its application. And I'm glad we had a couple's case and an individual's case. So that kind of gave us a flavor of how to use actually IPART in both situations. I'm gonna leave it out to questions. So if people would like to either type the questions in the chat or put on their microphone and ask something. We have about 20 minutes for questions before we wrap up. So comment. Yeah, go ahead.
I can share with everybody before we go into the questions, just briefly here, because when you're putting the PowerPoint, it's difficult to just take all the screen. I want to share with the audience the recovery from rejection, the manual for clients, the handout that Dave and I were referring to. So this is, you can find that in the website in the reference section that we give to you, so everybody actually can download it. It's on Rona Research Publications. Rona Research Publication, that's where you can find this manual, and it is very interesting. You know, it has an overview of acceptance rejection theory, personal acceptance rejection theory, and then some client's handout. That's actually the one that Dave was referring to as part of his case. So I strongly encourage everybody here to go to this material, read it. It's gonna give you a lot of insight into how you can incorporate as well IPARTheory in your work. So this is one other resource that is going to be very helpful for people who are working with clients. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. That's very generous. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in at this point?
Yes,
just
please.
to follow up on Tatiana's remarks. If anyone is interested in, this manual is now available in about 8 languages, including Arabic. But it turns out that the Arabic translation really is not suitable for use in clinical settings with clients. So if anyone is interested in retranslating it into Arabic, it would be very welcome throughout the Arab world. there are now well over 300 studies that have been done on IPAR theory alone in the Arab world. And the manual would be having that available to clinicians and researchers would be a great value, I think, to everyone.
Thank you, Ron. Maybe this is something we can discuss with AUC and maybe have it a joint project. Where's Noor? I cannot see her now, but maybe this is something we can follow up on, Noor, and see if there's
Yeah,
interest.
that would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, it's Nurazaki who told me that it really is not suitable for clinical use in Arabic, and so
Why is that? Can you explain a bit more? What's the translation like?
Nur.
The language is not really cannot really be used in clinical setting. Like it's very formal Arabic, and this is not really how we speak. So
Okay.
to have all the assessments in that language, that would be very difficult to use in clinical practice.
So it's using the formal Arabic, right?
Yeah, formal and literal translation kind of thing. It's not really accurate. It doesn't really get the cultural aspect as well.
Yeah, okay. So it's interesting because I mean, you know, the Arab countries, they speak, we write and read the same formal Arabic, but we speak different dialects, and that makes it a bit challenging in terms of translation. It either has to be very formal and heavy, or it has to be yes, the colloquial versus modern standard Arabic. Thank you, Hanan. Or it has to be, you know, captured by, once I actually, just to give you an anecdote, I was translating something and I ran it by one of our Egyptian colleagues. And he looked at me and he's like, what is this? This is the Lebanese translation. And I'm like, what? I thought that was good. And he's like, this is Lebanese. So he's like looking very down on our Arabic. But he said it, دي ترجمة لبنانية. in a very condescending way. But so I think I'm sure we can find the midway, something we can do together.
Yeah, like a common ground that can be understood by different dialects, definitely.
Exactly. Yasmin on the chat, Yasmin Saleh. Hi, Yasmin. It's good to see you here. I would be happy to collaborate on future projects, especially with assessments. Wonderful. Great. So we can see, there you go, Ron. We probably are going to put together now a working group on that. Hanan Al-Malla, I've done this in Sweden before for other assessments. Okay. So, Joelle, if you can take note of the names and then we can contact them later, maybe through Noor. Great. So questions now to focus more on the IPART theory. Actually, as I was listening, I had a question thinking of some of the difficult contexts that children are raised in, especially in our region, contexts of violence and wars, insecurity. Has there been any research done in such contexts where really raising children is really raising them in a context of animosity and rejection, and a lot of times? Sometimes rejection by another group in the society, not necessarily by the family itself, but sometimes by the larger society. Any input on that? Any thoughts? How that impacts the development?
Well, in the Arab-speaking world, I think that there have been some studies that are very much relevant. If you should have the recent edition that just was sent out a couple of days ago of the IPARTheory newsletter, and in that newsletter, Ramadan Ahmed in Egypt wrote a review of the article of the research that's been done in the Arab-speaking world about IPART theory. In that, you'll find, I think, some studies that are relevant to your question. And then it's also the case that we have some work going on in Africa where the former children who were forced to become soldiers, and brutalized. The girls were raped, some of the boys were raped, tortured. They were put out on the front lines to be the first to be killed and whatnot. Those people, those young people, are now young adults reaching marriageable age. They're establishing relationships, and a project is going on to find out what are they like, what can we do to help them deal with the profound trauma that they experience as kids growing up. If someone will write to me, I don't have the information right at the top of my head here about. I think it's a study that is being done at Harvard, but I'd have to go back and look, and we could get some information about what they're finding and about the conditions under which this work is being done. Yes, there are several places where in Bangladesh, with some of the people who with Uyghurs, some work is going on there, and elsewhere. I see you popped in here. Did you want to mention something about what might be going on in Pakistan or elsewhere?
I just wanted to mention that we have a study and we collected data from more than 13 countries, and what our countries are higher toward the rejection as compared to other countries. So then we deeper that in terms of looking at is that a religious country is go where the data, and we compare that Arabic speaking countries with countries Iran and Bangladesh. But disregard of the religious beliefs, we found that in Arabic speaking countries, the children scored higher on rejection, slightly higher, and it's because of the current situation, and the data is very recent. So working on that, and we're comparing that is ongoing.
That's interesting.
And I should point out here that the fact that these scores are higher rejection, kids are experiencing rejection. It's just the scores are relative and significantly higher than in compared Muslim groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so we have some questions here. Somebody has a raised hand. Turkey, go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you everyone first for the amazing presentation. I have two questions, one for David and one for Tatiana. David, I really like the example you gave about Michael Jackson and the reenactment of childhood trauma. And you said if you were his therapist, you would make him grieve the losses are related to trauma. So can you give us more about how you can help clients grieve the loss when it makes them fixated at a certain trauma and they want to relive it again or want to get out of it in their own way? That is not helpful. Question to the question to Tatiana.
Well, or I can go ahead and jump in, and then
Okay.
you can
Please,
have
please.
for hers. I think, one of the things that I do think is developing a good relationship with someone. It takes a long time. Just thinking about, this is not Michael Jackson, but I had a client recently, and you probably know there's some controversy about this whole mask stuff. In America there is. You've got some people think it's ridiculous, and other people think that it's ridiculous not to take it ridiculous. So one of my clients, she grew up in a very, very horrible home, and actually, her parents smoked marijuana and as she was growing up, and didn't really love her and kicked her out. She ended up moving in with a pedophile. and talk about rejection, that her parents would not protect her. But anyway, so she had a lot of loss related to that. And so when her church shut down because of COVID, she was furious with the leaders, just absolutely furious. And she was telling me how mad she was at them, and why was they shutting it down, and why can't she go to church? And so I helped her see that her church became her family. And when she got cut off from it, she tapped into all this loss, these feelings of loss. And so when I helped her see that, she began to cry and weep. And that deeper primary grieving, which Tatiana talked about, that she tries to get to, so helping them do that grief work. But sometimes you can't get there for a while until they trust you. But I try to encourage that, and I try to help them almost like a death. And let's go through the grief process. And I try to be as compassionate, allowing them to talk about it. So that's, I don't know if that helps, but there's certainly your relationship with a client, which can take one woman, it took 5 years for her to trust me. She did so much. She said, she goes, Dave, I did everything I could to test you. She was suicidal. And she said, finally, after 5 years, I concluded that you were safe. And then I could start doing more of that grief work.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. A quick question to Tatiana. It's also related to the case you presented. And you said that both couples had rejection issues in their with their primary caregivers when they were children, and then you helped them and by applying the IPART theory. How about if you have only one of the partners having rejection issues and the other partner have a warm, loving environment? So will you still work with them as a couple, or will you refer the person to individual therapy? That's it.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. That's a great question.
Thank you.
So there are cases in which, you are going to work with people who had different kinds of experiences while growing up. So definitely in this specific case, both of them experienced rejection. And it's not necessary to work that on individual therapy. There are cases in which there is, for example, if we were talking about incorporating the clinical case that Dave discussed, definitely, we perhaps would need to refer that person to do their individual work because it's much more severe in some extent. So in that specific case scenario, yes, I would be, referring. Me as a therapist, I wouldn't be the person who does the job, and the reason for that is because I don't want to create an extra alliance with one of the partners. So there are cases in which you are referring that, for example, one person is rejected and the other person has grown up in a loving environment, right? So that happens. So what is the idea of EFT? We are using to discuss rejection, not as a way to try to find who we need to blame for in the relationship. So that's not the idea. The idea is of the other person understand where this person is coming from so that they can accept that, as part of their process. So in the case of John and Lisa, so John, for example, is coming, with this anger, but it's kind of like he experienced that as he was growing up. So Lisa doesn't know that a piece of information. So all that she's seeing is this anger. So as you start continuing working in session, so John is going to feel more vulnerable to being able to tell his story. And at some point you might say, Lisa, do you have that information, or what is happening to you as you are listening to John talking about his experience? So she didn't have that information. So now it's something new for her. So she's going to understand her partner with different lenses. So this is not necessarily about me. This is the only way that she knows how to be. So when you're working with a person, for example, who's coming in a loving relationship, there can be more burden. because there are some people who say, I never heard my parents fight. I never, for example, saw them insulting, or I never heard like they didn't pay attention to me. So since I don't know what that look like, so it's very difficult for me to be in this relationship. But if the person start understanding, the idea is you're never going to be able to erase the history of a person, but you can assign new meaning to that history, right? So when the person assign a new meaning to that history and say, I was rejected or I was neglected, that doesn't mean that that will define my future. If I enter into therapy and I'm capable of understanding, accepted, befriend, somehow with my experience, I can change and transform my current relationship. Like I have had people in therapy, for example, who are afraid of becoming parents. They say, I'm coming from a family in which we didn't know what was going to happen next day. And like we were so terrified about, father coming, and it was an alcoholic and coming and hit my mom and so on and so forth. So I don't want to be, a parent. I am afraid of that. I love children, but I don't want to be. So couples that come and say, I want to be a mother. I think, I want to be a mother, and he does not want to be a father. And he didn't say, he doesn't know his story. So he's afraid of that. So he believes that because he had that experience, now he's going to be the same. In other words, a perception of lack of control about your potential role as a father. When that person start understanding and see the support of the other person. In EFT, in emotionally focused therapy, there is an acronym that is very important. That is kind of like the end of the sessions. Is R. Are you there for me? And R means accessible, responsive, and engaged. So when I perceive that I can rely on my partner, that's my partner, that I feel sad and I'm able to verbalize that to my partner, that I feel, for example, that I need connection now and my partner responds to that. So my relationship will start to be transformed into something positive. So that's kind of like the way how I conceptualize and work in this.
Thank you, Tatiana. We have a comment and two questions and very few minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly over them. Hanan, you said parenthood has become very constrained due to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, for instance, which is very, very true. Actually, many things have been constrained. Christina said, we have seen the great transformation that happened to Samantha, David, in the case that you presented. Can we please have more talk about how can IPART handle forgiveness issues? David, can you answer that? How can IPART handle forgiveness issues in a few sentences?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would refer you to Everett Worthington's work on forgiveness. Give me 1 second, I'll pull his book out. But Dr. Everett Worthington, he's one of the top names in our country doing forgiveness work. He actually had to work it through in his own life when his mother was murdered. But he has steps that you can talk people through. So you might want to, I don't know his website, but Dr. Everett Worthington is, and I think Jimmy Carter, former President Carter, endorsed. I don't know if you can see that, but can you see the name?
Can you type it in the chat, David? Do you mind? Just the name. I think
the chat. Okay.
I think it's this, but if you see it,
okay.
There's like a little bubble.
But, what I do is, I mean, I don't use all his stuff, but I integrate stuff. But what I'll do is I'll have people identify. Like I had a couple the other day, and whenever the wife would pass, when you can never take some time to do forgiveness work, and let's identify the past memories that are most hurtful and you're angry about, and then let's work them through to forgive. But I don't have time to go through all the steps, but this is a good resource if I ever Worthington.
Okay. Thank you. And then last question. Thank you for such an insightful talk. I wanted to ask if you found any instances where cultural contexts were an obstacle in helping clients set their boundaries. So was culture sometimes, or an example where it actually was an obstacle in setting boundaries?
Yes, I have had the opportunity to work with people with different cultures, but one of the clear example, I mean, when you read this question, it can have different answers, but just to give you an example, was working with a couple in which it was an intermarriage couple in which one of the members of the couple was a Latina person. In this specific case, for example, they have this agreement again in thing, and the wife's parents, and family were Latino, suggestions about the child reading. One of the things that it was very difficult with, the husband. And the husband actually responds to that in a very negative way. So he kind of like say, so this is way too much. They're all the time, involved in our relationship. They determine, they suggest, they think, they say, so what are we gonna do? So in that specific case, boundary was very difficult because you cannot tell the wife, okay, so just cut up your relationship with your family of origin, right? So like in Latino culture, there's a saying like, you marry the person and you marry the family, right? It's kind of like the way how it goes. So there is a lot of work, to do there to come to a midpoint, in which the husband also learn how to appreciate to what extent he has been culturally immersed in a productive way in that relationship, because he cannot immediately accept, but he has to be culturally immersed, which is different, so that he has permission to say aloud what are the things that he has conflict with, but at the same time, learning to appreciate other aspects. So it's a matter of providing balance.
Thank you, Tatiana. We have the same saying in Arabic, actually. So that also applies, I think, to the Arab region, whereby you do marry the family as as much as the spouse. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're coming towards the end of the session. It's been wonderful having you. Thank you so much for all the sharing your expertise and giving us really a great idea about IPART. I think a project is going to come out of today's meeting. I have a feeling, if not more. And thank you so much. And if I can have the resources, if you can send them to me, and I will send them to all our participants. That way they can look up any references they need. Noor, any last words?
Thank you very much for including me in this. And if you have any other questions, you have my email address. I wish we had more time, but we're doing the best with the time we have.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much.
wish
We'll
we
have,
had more time as
yeah,
well.
I know, we all do. Maybe we can have another session
Yeah.
maybe in a few months from now.
Yes, hopefully it will be the first of many collaborations.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Tatiana?
We're gonna be very happy. We're gonna be very happy to collaborate anytime that you need us. And thank you so much for inviting us here. We appreciate the questions, the time to listen to us, and I hope that we contribute to spark your interest in to learn more about IPART theory. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the theory and on behalf of the Roner Center, we want to thank you with all our heart for hosting and sponsoring and getting your people involved in Lebanon and in Egypt and whatnot. I think it's been a very productive session. And I look forward to hearing from anybody about any of these things that you would want to and collaborate if you have such an interest now and in the future. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and stay safe, everyone. Good night.
Yes, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.